Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is May 22nd, 2019, and my guest is journalist and author Michael Brendan Dougherty. He writes for National Review. His new book is My Father Left Me Ireland, An American Son's Search for Home, which is our topic for today. Michael, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Your book is an extended meditation on being a son, being a father, your Irish heritage, what it means to come from somewhere, how we think about nationalism, national identity, American culture, and a little bit more, but I think that's enough. And despite all that, it's a very short book, and I found it deeply moving. It's written in the form of a series of letters to your father. Give us a sketch of your childhood and your relationship with your father.
Sure. I was born in 1982 in the suburbs of New York in New Jersey, in Bloomfield, New Jersey, to a single mother, my mother, Mary Ellen, and she and I lived with her parents in their family home. My father and mother met while my mother was traveling through Europe, kind of in the late 70s, early 80s. My mother had, her best friend was an Irish Londoner, and this best friend was dating my father's best friend. And then my parents met, had a kind of, I would say a summer love affair. That's what I've pieced together through talking to my father and going through the letters. And then at some point, my mother wrote to him and told her that she was pregnant. And my father, I think there was some uncertainty whether he would come and join in these first initial weeks, whether he would, come over and have a shotgun marriage. But ultimately, he decided to stay in Ireland. He went back to an old girlfriend. And in the years afterward, he built a family with her, had 3 more children. And I was raised here, and I got to see, unlike most American families that are broken, I didn't have weekends with my father. I couldn't fly to Dublin every week, or have like the double holidays that most kids have. I would see my father once every 2 or 3 years, sometimes for maybe a week or two, and sometimes maybe just for a few hours. And so I knew him that way. And then my mother, my mother never married, never had any other children. But in my early childhood, she kind of filled the home, among other things, with lots of Irish stuff and songs, a little bit of the Irish language. She got heavily involved in an Irish language student group in the United States, and sort of attached herself to this, half Irish American, half diaspora Irish culture that existed in New York and in Boston in the 1980s. And that would have, had some, my mother would have been very concerned about the troubles in Northern Ireland and would have had very strong and typically Irish American views on that conflict. I can remember people almost spitting on the name of Margaret Thatcher when I was young. That's like an early memory for me, was that there was this woman we hated somewhere. Those were kind of the basics of it.
And your relationship with your father begins to change when you become a father. What happened?
Yeah, so I mean, it was slowly changing in my adulthood as my mother was no longer a kind of go-between or someone that he would have to deal with. You know, their relationship was kind of a wreck, mostly because she had fallen head over heels in love with him and had his child, and he was not in love with her, ultimately. And though he admired her very much. And so it started to change as I was a young adult, after I got out of my mother's house. But then it really started changing as I was becoming a father, and in the year or two before, I suddenly had noticed, I suppose, when my wife told me she was pregnant, I suddenly was filled up with this desire to do, it turns out, exactly what my mother did, which was start learning the Irish language, start paying a lot more attention to what's happening in Ireland politically. And then also, in a sense, I kind of was falling in love with my father, the way my mother did, but as a son. And so the communication opened up, and this was happening at a time, from 2014, the book's letters, if you took someone to forensically date them, the book's letters basically run from 2014 through the beginning of 2017. And it's in this time that Ireland was commemorating some important centenary anniversaries that were important in its history, from the passage of a Home Rule Bill to the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin and beyond. And we're still kind of in those centenaries now with, now you'd be commemorating the Anglo-Irish War and so on. So Ireland was sort of reflecting on its own history, and I'm kind of listening into that conversation as I am reflecting on it myself, as I'm sort of recovering it for my children. And in a way, it's a way of also reaching out and understanding my own father. So yeah, that's kind of the heart of the book.
Now, along the way, by the way, my I was telling my son about your book and about this interview, and he said, "What's this have to do with EconTalk?" Which is a fair question. And one answer, of course, is, well, I'm interested in it. But the deeper answer is there are a number of larger themes besides the Dougherty family Renaissance, which is a beautiful part of the book, that Renaissance. But it's also there are many other parts of the book which we're going to start to turn to.
Sure.
So along the way of you telling that story of your own fatherhood and how it changes your relationship to your own father, you sketch out Irish identity and the Irish national story. And in particular, you talk about that story that the Irish people tell themselves. And there's more than one. Some of those stories are kitschy, some are romanticized. You describe some of them as plastic or commercial, inherently false. What are some of those stories that you think should be rejected, and how would you describe the story that you've embraced?
Well, so when you look back on, I don't know if listeners know this, but the focus of Irish politics from the late 19th century up until World War I is through this Irish parliamentary party, and for the achievement of a home rule parliament, a parliament in Dublin, the idea of restoring a parliament to Dublin that takes the Irish interest more seriously. And in this period especially from 1898, the Queen's visit, until 1916, there's a lot of, kind of nationalist culture and talk in Ireland. There is an attempt at language revival. The Irish language had been, dying for a few centuries, and then really took a tremendous fall down the stairs during the famine in the middle of the 19th century. There were attempts at writing Irish histories, and many of them were pretty poor, just full of legendary argle-bargle about how the Irish language was the one pure language to come out of Babel. It's something like that, or made of all the most beautiful parts. My interpretation of what is happening in this period, when I look back on it, is it's a kind of emotional compensation for the accepted reality at that time that Ireland was fundamentally a broken nation and a kind of failure, right? That there's a good chance you have to emigrate. That there's not, Ireland is not producing anything all that important for the world at that time.
For literature.
Well, that is what starts happening in the 20th century. Is Yeats and Joyce, and then suddenly this is what Ireland is probably best known for throughout the world, is its English literature from this period. Now, what I found exciting about the kind of revolutionary nationalist heroes of 1916 was they decided to actually move a little bit beyond this kind of sentimental picture of the home. Not that they lacked for sentiment, but they had tons of it. Yeah. And they wanted to move a little bit beyond the romance, though they were very romantic, and to try to treat Ireland in this extremely serious way and stern way as this great inheritance that was jeopardized and could potentially disappear from the face of the earth. That there are nations that are eventually subsumed and die. And so Patrick Pearse, Owen McNeill, and others believed part of their project would be political and eventually cultural separation from the United Kingdom. And there was something obviously that resonated with me at that time in my life where I'm becoming a father, where you're looking back on a difficult past and then trying to build something better out of it. So I had this, not only this primed affinity from my youth for these figures, from my mother's songs and my upbringing, but also this kind of emotional time in my life of becoming a father. And then I think most of us naturally think back on our own childhoods when we become parents and decide what we want to give and what we want to reject. And so suddenly I'm reading these histories and seeing, men searching through the history of their broken homeland and trying to find something kind of glorious in it to build for posterity. So of course it really resonated with me.
But some people would react to that. And I'm sure some listeners are thinking like, so, what's that have to do with a boy raised in suburban New Jersey? What's that have to do with the daughter of that man?
Yeah.
And then I want to read a short passage where you write about your own self-image in your youth and adolescence. And I think it's a way that most of us raised in America think about ourselves, at least many of us, which is we can be anything we want. We're untethered by our parents' nationality, their religion, their values. We're just blank slates, and the stylus is in our own hands, and we can write our own story. And here's the way you describe it rather powerfully. When I was a child, the nation's president disclosed to us his preference in underwear for a laugh. The adult world that I encountered was plainly terrified of having authority over children, and tried to exercise as little of it as practicable. At every turn, my mother, my teachers, and the church just sort of gave up and gave in to whatever I wanted. They seemed grateful when a child wasn't difficult. The constant message of authority figures was that I should be true to myself. I should do what I loved, and I could love whatever I liked. I was the authority. In the benighted past somewhere, there was pain and misery, but baby boomers had largely corrected this for us in their titanic generational battles. This I would call the myth of liberation. I was raised on this mythology, and it ordered the world around me. The future ought to be bright. This was the end of history. And wasn't it good? And so my question is, end of quote, my question is, in the benighted past somewhere there was pain and misery. So your father comes from a country that had this terrible past where they were held down by the British, oppressed. They struggled for liberation. They rise up in 1916. Hundreds of people get killed. The leaders of this rebellion get executed by the British. Who cares? Why is that relevant for Michael Brendan Dougherty? And particularly, why is it relevant for Michael Brendan Dougherty's daughter?
Yeah. So what I try to do in the book is show how that upbringing I describe, in which there was no authority higher than the self, and that this was constantly communicated to us through, the culture. I mean, in 100 years, we'll look back and I think we'll look at it as a kind of propaganda. I mean, I almost don't even mean that pejoratively. I just mean this was what was propagated to us. And what I try to describe is both how at the time that I was most under the sway of this view of the world, and in the 90s it seemed very convincing to me, even to me, that there was a kind of there was a dark edge to it. There was it gave a weightlessness to my existence, right? I mean, many people find that as they mature into adults, part of the crucible of forming their character is accepting or rejecting what has been given to them. And in a way, it was like the culture, in a kind of perverse way, was almost trying to rob me of that ability. I mean, in a perverse way, of course, I do exactly that. This book is a kind of rejection of that 1990s view of the world. But I talk about that weightlessness, and then I also talk about, in a sense, how it left me unprepared and ill-equipped to meet some of the real challenges of adult life, including financial disaster that my mother faced late in life, including her death. That kind of make your own adventure at all times culture actually imposes a lot on you and actually extracts a lot of costs out of you at strange times where, a traditional, say like a traditional Irish culture that still exists in the Aran Islands to a degree, there's a ritual about funeral that is kind of given to you, and it takes all sorts of forms: prayer, ceremony, drink, what people bring to your house. When I was faced with my mother's death in my young adulthood, I was just given an endless series of menu options to begin creating a meaning out of this for myself. And that actually is that does impose a cost. I mean, we tend to think that it's a gift, but actually I thought it was a very mean thing to do to a bereaved young man, which was say, effectively, like, well, make a meaning out of your mother's death for yourself entirely from scratch if you like. It's actually cruel in its way. because it robs you of the ability to know whether you have grieved properly or whether you've done the right thing. It leaves you second guessing.
I want to put a Hayekian spin on it. In a way, I think, it's a beautiful example of tradition and the value of tradition. In America, I think today we're very skeptical of that tradition. As you say, we're encouraged to think we can make our own, create our own traditions, our own rituals. And I think what Hayek would say, although he was not a religious man, and I'm sure found many traditions unappealing personally. But what he would say, and I think what the pragmatist philosophers would say, is that we don't understand everything. There's a lot of wisdom in the world embodied in tradition that is not rational, in the sense that if you could pick and choose, you might not choose this particular set. And so you were given the opportunity to just rationally make up your own, and surely that would be better. And yet, that ignores the fact that the traditions that evolved on those islands, or in my case, in Judaism, which is, Jews and the Irish have some things in common.
Yeah.
Language, tradition, feeling of times colonialism under the hands of the British, in Israel and Palestine at the time. So, in Judaism, there's incredible specific things that you do when someone passes away. And, of course, there are constraints. But I think what you're arguing, what I would argue as well, is that they're actually liberating. Those constraints allow you to not have to think about a bunch of things. And they're constraints that weren't just imposed by some cruel person or some arbitrary person or culture. They evolved over millennia. And, quote, they work.
And they allow you to know that what you did was right and proper, right? That you did something that was worthy, and that almost becomes worthy merely because so many other people have gone this way, right? That
well, there's an honor in it in that way, and it's not obvious that it should be a good thing. I mean, you could argue, it's just it is somewhat arbitrary, and the fact that you feel compelled to do something that your ancestors did, or that your family has done for dozens or hundreds or even thousands of years, that's just you could argue that's just some goofy, habit. There's no reason, there's no value in that. That's bizarre. Why would you think that? In particular, you could say, now here's one way to think of the question. Michael Brendan Dougherty, with the freedom to choose whatever he wants, could say, I really like Jewish rituals around funerals. So I'm gonna sit Shiva, which means I'm gonna stay in my house for 7 days, mourn the person, gonna have people over, as opposed to say awake. Awake, that's what Irish people do, but I don't have to do that. And so you could choose your own ritual, and say the Jewish one really appeals to me. It's fascinating to me that isn't what most people do. They want to be part of that longer continuum.
Right. And it's also part of this larger sense that this myth of liberation also not only robbed me of things like that, right? The ability to quickly organize a funeral that would be proper and decent for my mother, but also that seemed to somewhat dissolve people's sense of obligation to one another, even emotionally. I talk in the book a little bit about the way my mother's life as a single mother was not what, in a way that the culture was starting to make a promise in the 1980s and 90s that, hey, single moms, you're heroes. We love you. We honor what you do.
Just a choice.
But yeah, ultimately, but ultimately, because in a sense it was her choice, right? She wasn't a widow. Because it was her choice, in a way, the fact that men weren't as interested in a single mother, as a potential romantic partner or spouse, the fact that people didn't offer as much help as you would offer a widow, it was because it was her choice. So you should suffer. In a sense, it was like, you made this choice, now suffer for it. Was the actual private and operating message from the culture. And in a way, it robbed her of her sense of feeling wronged by my father or wronged by her circumstances, and it robbed her. And it robbed her of some of the publicly proclaimed sense of heroism for raising a child on her own, for working hard while she did so. And so, this book was also my attempt to kind of honor her and portray her as someone like Patrick Pearse, this, person who made themselves into an Irish-speaking Irish nationalist and then made huge sacrifices on behalf of a better future.
Patrick Pearse being one of the leaders of the Easter Rebellion in Easter Rising in 1916.
Right. And so, I wanted to honor her that way. And so that's right. That myth of liberation was insufficient, and it was insufficient to honor her.
I want to go back to something you said that kind of hinted at in the beginning of that comment, which is that there's a certain self-centeredness to American culture, which we often celebrate, right?
Right.
It's in the Declaration of Independence to some extent. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, one person's pursuit of happiness is not another's. In particular, I'm not sure that the founders, by the pursuit of happiness, might have meant what we today mean by that phrase. But putting that to the side, I think it's almost a cliche that Americans are disconnected from one another, that we struggle to connect to other human beings, that we're lost in our screens. And some of that, of course, is pure technology. But some of it is what I think you're talking about. I haven't really thought about it, and I'm sure I'll offend some listeners who don't like this kind of thinking, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. Our obligations to each other are unpleasant often. We'd rather they weren't there. I'd often rather not visit my friend in the hospital, take my parents' phone call with their latest computer problem, or just whatever it is, in the middle of something. And I've tried to answer the phone when I see it's my parents, try to answer it, even if it's just to say I can't talk right now, because they're 88 and 86 and they don't get out so much.
Right.
And so it's an incredible kindness to take their call, and it's the least I can do for them, given what they did for me. And I feel an obligation there. Some of it's religious. There's a biblical commandment to honor your parents. And to me, one of the ways that manifests itself in my life is I take their phone call. And we just are a lot of us, and there are other parts of my life where I'm not such a saint. Don't worry. I don't mean to brag here, but, and you might think I'm a fool for doing that. But I think that sense of obligation, and connection to one another is been deeply damaged by our disconnect from our roots and from our religion and from our ethnic heritage, whatever it is. And it gets transformed maybe into food habits, like, Italians might eat more spaghetti than other people, or whatever it is. But I think and of course it's a simultaneous system. As our culture becomes less connected, we're going to feel less compelled to see those obligations. So I don't want to suggest that causation only runs in one direction. But I think part of what your book is about and what you're saying now is that weightless, which is deeply appealing sometimes, that weightless, tetherless way that we're sometimes raised and our culture often emphasizes does come at a human cost of connection.
Right. It comes at a cost of connection. It comes at a cost of meaning, I think. And I think, I hint very subtly in the book. I think it also comes at a cost potentially in our politics and in a kind of a backwash or reaction to that enemy and disconnectedness. One of the things running through the book is this sense of, very quickly, a world that had been very rich for me with meaning in my early childhood, with lots of connections to a foreign country, to a large extended family, a kind of larger diaspora community. Very quickly, in the space of 2 decades, 2.5 decades, petered out to effectively nothing. It was my mother and me, and then my mother dies. I was not raised with siblings. My half siblings were 3,000 miles away, and I barely knew them. And so that I think that sense of the family shrinking that many of us have experienced, I think many people my age have experienced, watching the reunions get smaller and not be replenished with other young people, or not be continued by young people because they scatter and move. I think there's something to that is in some ways feeding the resurgent. I haven't done the studies on this, of course, but my intuition that informed this book was that this shrinkage of our social life and those connections is informing this nationalist reaction across the world. That it's just interesting to me that, and like I said, I don't know if there's a mathematical formula here, but it is interesting to me that countries with incredibly low fertility rates often produce these nationalist movements and leaders. Putin, Hungary, Poland, they all have seen their fertility rates plunge unbelievably. Now, it hasn't happened everywhere. Spain hasn't gone that way, even though the numbers would suggest it. But I do wonder if there's something to it, because I've noticed, as people noticed a lot, I think that the trolley, alt-right, and other things, I kind of noticed that it seemed like a lot of these young men were fatherless boys the way I was at one time too. But they are looking for this much more abstract connection. Maybe they don't have someone to connect to the way I did. And so I do wonder if that's informing our politics, is that the feeling of the destruction of the family home is leading to this impatient, fevered, sometimes fanatical sense of having to retrieve the glory of the larger country around it.
Well, I like to say that human beings want to be part of something larger than themselves. And if it isn't country, it's religion. If it's not country and religion, it's a political ideology. I think a lot of the something that's going on, I don't know how much of it is due to this, but something that's going on is that we're tribal. Human beings are tribal, as Sebastian Junger pointed out in his book, Tribe, that we talked about here on EconTalk, and we'll find a tribe. And if we can't find one, we'll make one. And if we can't make one, we'll look for one, and we eventually find one. And nation as a tribe was in decline. It's coming back for whatever
Right.
reason.
There's definitely generational sway too, I think, and that's also part of the book, is that there's people react to the previous generation. So, I'm describing my own reaction to the 90s, and maybe people a little bit younger than me are in reaction to the early 2000s and what they see as the failures and insufficiency of the previous generation. And are aiming to course correct, maybe even in a huge way.
I want to talk about something related to this, which is you're a conservative, and
right.
Probably the most conservative idea in your book, which is really out of favor. Maybe conservative is not the right word in this case. It might be old-fashioned. Is the courage and honor that comes from a willingness to die for a nation or a cause. Right. And I would say on both ends of the two opposite ends of the political spectrum, libertarians and cosmopolitans, so you could say they have something in common. But I'm thinking of progressives who would describe themselves as citizens of the world, and libertarians who would also describe themselves in some sense that way. Both groups downplay or find national borders appalling or destructive or unhelpful. And they look at the idea of dying for your country as antiquated or worse, foolish.
Perverse.
Yeah, stupid, just irrational. Like, why would you do something like that? Why are they wrong? What did you find in your – I mean, you really romanticize the rebels who were part of the Easter Rising in 1916, who at the time, it looked like they died for nothing.
Right.
And whether that sacrifice was worth it today is a different question. But talk about why you look at them the way you do.
Well, I mean, it was the most countercultural. It's you say it's old-fashioned. I would say it's almost countercultural at this point. I mean, I was raised in this. We describe this liberated 90s, but I would even say my public school education, right, would have emphasized and juxtaposed, say, a little film footage of the boys going over in 1917 and a little fife and drum of over there, and then immediately pan toward utter carnage and destruction and the meaninglessness of it. And it was emphasized in a sense like how stupid and deluded and useless and vain their deaths were. And in many cases, I would say
they were onto something.
I would say not that they're entirely wrong, but I would say you can criticize their commanders for spending their lives like they were nothing. But I'm now hesitant to criticize them, the soldiers, as totally deluded. And I'm actually more likely to blame the later delusion on their leaders. But the fact is, now lots of little transformations happen when you have a child. But one of the ones that gets talked about, I think, very, quietly or sometimes expressed among men, or at least among a couple of fathers I know, which was that you just meet your child. It's just, your baby is just born, and you suddenly feel a couple of things. One, you feel the desire to be a better version of yourself, right? You feel inadequate to the task. At least I did.
You're not alone.
But you also feel, I think this is pretty common among men, and I don't think it's talked about often in public, but you also feel suddenly and strangely, and this can even frighten you, readier to kill or to die on behalf of this child, right? Like, if it came to it, I would throw my life in front of a moving bus to save this child, If the bus is careening down at the stroller and it was me or the me or the stroller, of course, you just throw your life away immediately. And that you'd be happy to do so. And that is the basis for this larger sense of patriotism, or this larger idea of the nation as a home, which it is in certain times. It requires you to be courageous and indomitable and valiant and proud and willing to die to safeguard it, because it provides, and not just because it provides all these goods, right? Like, I hate talking about it in this econometric way,
instrumental way,
in an overly instrumental way. But the fact is, it does provide those goods, and so just as you would defend your child from harm, and you would be willing to do violence to others to prevent the harm to your child, there are times when someone intends the harm or the death or destruction or the suborning of your nation, and it will require some great sacrifice on your part to keep that nation alive into the future. And of course, what is fascinating about the rebels of 16 that I'm talking about is how self-conscious they were about this idea of, well, even if it's a doomed battle, we have to put it up because we have to keep alive at least the tradition of rebellion. There hasn't been a rebellion in our generation, and if we don't rebel, then the tradition dies, and in a sense, the nationhood dies with it. They predicted as they were going in. You can look at their letters. Patrick Pearson and others said, well, people will say hard things of us now, but we'll be blessed by unborn generations. And of course, and he was right. And what the astonishing thing is that he was right, is that they were at first denounced as traitors and communists. And then as people gradually came to know who they were blessed as the saviors and deliverers of the Irish nation, which, and I have to emphasize this, was universally recognized as a kind of failed state. And so their sacrifice gives Ireland the pride of nationhood back again. It was countercultural for them to speak about their nation in that serious way, and it totally transformed that country. Some revisionist historians would say for the worse. They would say, the costs of leaving the United Kingdom, the costs of continuing conflict in Northern Ireland were too much, and you could debate that. I think, however, the loss of the Irish nation itself would have been a greater loss.
Well, you would have been even more weightless had that happened. I think meaning is a tricky word, but I think you're getting at something quite deep that is very difficult for a modern person to think about, which is, if you made a list of what you're willing to die for, I think most of us would say that nothing. Okay, maybe our children. Yeah, maybe. And I want to talk about parenting in a minute. We'll come back to that in a second. But outside of our children, which people would say, well, that's just biological. That's just evolution. Of course, you'll die for your children. But is there a cause that you would even risk your life for? Most of us would struggle to answer that in America in 2019, because life is easy for many, many people. That's a feature, not a bug, that I don't even have to think about it.
It is a feature, and it should be jealously praised as a feature that most of us don't have to do this. But there are moments of stress and in history where you do have where someone will be called upon to do it, and one could imagine it. One could imagine a conflict in the future where John Paul Jones's sentiment, "Give me liberty or give me death."
You mean Patrick Henry?
Patrick Henry.
Yeah, I have to quote the first part of that, actually, because as soon as you started that, I was thinking of Patrick Henry. He says, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what choice others may make, but as for myself, give me liberty or give me death." And that's a heck of a speech.
Right. And that rhetoric, exact rhetoric of slavery as the alternative features in the rebellion I'm talking about. And one could easily imagine, or maybe not so easily, but one could imagine if the United States fell into civil strife and depression and decline, and suddenly was offered the humble tutelage of Beijing's tender administrations modeled on what's being done in the Xinjiang province. Suddenly, this willingness to kill and die for an idea or an ideal, an old scrap of parchment, which had heretofore been deemed a tribute to the hypocrisies of the founding generation. Some of that would make sense again. It would feel urgent and necessary.
And on the flip side, it must be admitted, I'm sympathetic to your point, but on the flip side, it must be admitted that the stoking of that willingness to die, of course, leads to militarism that is not so romantic, not so good.
Course, yeah.
So we want to keep it in perspective, but I can't help, as you talk, I can't help thinking of Tennyson's poem Ulysses, which I can't quote entirely from memory. It's quite long, so I've cheated and looked it up here. But what I was going to say before is that if you're not willing to die for anything, you might not be willing to live for much. And I think it's a cliche, but I think there is something there. And I think that's gets at the weightlessness that you felt before you had a daughter and before you connected back to your Irish heritage. But I want to read a couple lines from Ulysses, which is a romantic view that I held when I was a child. He's talking about Ulysses is old at this point. He's done all his great trips in Trojan War, and he says he's about to die. He says, "Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods." And then he says at the end, "Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." And that kind of heroism is it's just not part of our country anymore for whatever reason. It's just not.
We don't. Right. I mean, it's not part of our education system. It's not. Like people even 100 years ago at a boys' school, we would have athletic programs, and the athletic programs were not just about self-discipline, like a school of self-discipline, but in a sense they were kind of a preparatory for potential enlistment in armed forces, right? They're and now we talk about our athletic programs as sort of like preparing you for the job market someday, for the strife and conflict or whatever, the self-discipline it requires to succeed there. And we hide this idea of bravery and honor from people, and also that we teach tolerance, which is very good in a diverse society, but these martial virtues and this view of heroism also requires intolerance, right? Intolerance of injustice, intolerance of slavery, intolerance of
oppression.
Oppression or foreign rule or whatever. And listen, this is not immediately applicable in my life as far as I have no great work of violence I can recommend to anyone to do right now. Maybe I will in the future. But people who know me know me as someone who's pretty skeptical of war in the modern age. But I did still feel in writing this book that meditating on this history, meditating on my own upbringing, that this idea of putting sacrifice at the heart of manhood was still useful to me. It still helped me make sense of my life. It still helped me make sense of what would be right or wrong to do on behalf of my children and on my family, and also, of course, on behalf of my country or my countries and my church too. I mean, there has to be this willingness to risk, or else life becomes not just enervated but also quite boring.
Yeah, I want to. It's an important point. I want to emphasize that I don't think either of us are suggesting that violence is a good idea or that war is a good. It's a wonderful way that people get tested and turned into something more superior. It's a way people get killed. It's a horrible.
No, it is horrible.
Horrible historical failure most of the time. But I think the more important point here is passion and sacrifice. What are you passionate about? Not just, saying what are you willing to die for maybe is over dramatic. What are you passionate about? What would you sacrifice for? And I think I want to turn to the parenting issue. You write an extraordinary indictment of our culture of parenting. You say, it's as if this language of getting ahead and technocratic manipulation becomes the default mode of thinking around us, and we adapt ourselves to it when we don't know what to say. I'm discovering now how much parenting advice and guidance is packaged this way, how it recasts fathers not merely as providers but as social engineers, as wonks. Read to your child because children who read with their parents on average make $1 million more over life. Eat dinner with your child because a child who eats at a family table becomes more sociable and in the long run will marry better and get more promotions. Cuddle with a child. Cuddle children get better mortgage rates as adults, as if parenthood could be judged by the grades we get in school or the salaries we achieved. And I think that's obviously there's some exaggeration there, but I do think there is a temptation.
Is there?
Yeah, there is a temptation to see our job as parents as creators of our child's futures, which of course to some extent it is, when in fact I like to simply say it's part of the human experience to be with your children and to interact with them at dinner. It has nothing to do with what kind of spouse they'll become or what kind of parent they'll become or what they'll be able to do at work. It's just a glorious part of being alive and human. And I don't want to measure it. I don't want to find out. I don't need to measure it.
There is something also kind of deeply double-minded in our culture about this, which is that on the one hand, it's like publicly the ideal, the master idea of our politics, the one permissible license for all political motivation should be egalitarian, achieving a more egalitarian world, an egalitarian society. And yet privately, all the advice to parents is, here's how to get the extra 0.2% advantage for your child and how you should, dedicate yourself fanatically to it. There's a kind of weird double-mindedness that way.
Great point.
But I do think that there is a way that this book weaves together the public and the private in this way, because I see it weave together in my own life. That when in the 1990s, this sense of authority over children was considered authoritarian, and I could see my mother and my school and other authorities trying to not exercise their authority over me. And now I see it this idea of social engineering escaping from, or this mode of thinking escaping from Vox or any other number of political magazines, and colonizing our understanding of the family, right? Like, it's just it's a very natural thing for humans to do, right? Is to look for a pattern in the world and then match it to everything. And so, and that's part of what this book was doing, was suggesting a completely different pattern. And hopefully readers will, be inspired to imagine some of their own from it.
Well, the version of that cultural story you're telling about parenting is my favorite version of its conflict with the egalitarian impulse. Is the column I'm not going to link to, because I don't want to even try to find it, but I remember it vividly saying, it's wrong to reach your children because it gives them a leg up. Shame on you.
Right.
And, I don't know. I don't know where to start with that. I could do an hour-long monologue on how I think about that right. Exhortation, but I'll just say that I think that's bad advice. I'll just leave it at that. It's anyway. I want to talk about nationalism.
Sure.
I want to read a couple, I thought, beautiful passages. You say the following. And what is a nation? In this way of thinking, a nation is at best a problematic, if still useful, administrative unit. That is, it's merely the arena in which technocrats and wonks do their work of making improvements to society. And now our men of letters cannot develop a political or moral thought without searching out a social science abstract from which to loot it. Most of the time, I find they don't read the studies. Why bother? The authors of the studies know what the wonks desire to say and design studies to give their words the look of authority. It's a perpetual motion machine, and like a machine, it generates only the illusion of a working intelligence inside it. And then later on, you say the following. We are used to conceiving of the nation almost exclusively as an administrative unit. A nation is measured by its GDP. Its merit is discovered in how it lands on international rankings for this or that policy deliverable. A nation may have a language, but the priority is to learn the lingua franca of global business. Our idea of doing something for the nation is reduced to something almost exclusively technical. Policy wonks are the acknowledged legislators of our world. And I think that's very insightful. Do you want to expand on that or say anything else?
Listen, this book is also me throwing a gauntlet down before my peers. I think readers will notice language I'm borrowing and maybe baiting Ta-Nehisi Coates with, and here maybe I'm tangling with Ezra Klein. But I saw a paper issued by John Donahue and Stephen Levitt yesterday, where they were looking at I think the 2001 paper on abortion and crime. And it had this amazing statement tucked into it, which was, the choice of specification in the original paper provides a strong degree of discipline on the exercise we carry out, in contrast to the typical empirical economics paper, where the researchers run many specifications and only report a few of those. So it's just like, in the middle of this paper by
a cheap shot at our profession.
Well, not just a cheap shot, but like, if that is true, and Levitt is right about it, this is the standard practice, is to run many specifications. You basically run the data as many times as you need to produce a set of results buried within it that you can cherry pick and write the thesis you were intending on writing the whole time. I do worry that there is. I do sense that there's an incredible amount of intellectual fraud being perpetrated in our political discussions. a kind of an attempt by social scientists and allied journalists to insert ideas that everyone knows, but in fact, when you look at the sample sizes that these facts about our social world and human behavior are based on, they're tiny. I mean, I saw this even in, I started noticing this as political commentary has shifted in this direction of where you have to know social science inside and out to even begin opining, which itself is, by the way, I think is a kind of anti-democratic spirit. But be that as it may, I found even papers that I agreed with or that I sensed or intuited were correct because I agreed with them, say like George Borjas looking at wages and immigration. I would look at the actual size of the sample taken in Miami and just think, how could anyone possibly make a judgment based on, but perhaps as little as 30 or 60 data points, and make a sweeping statement about mass immigration and the effect of wages. It just seemed fraudulent.
I recommend to all economists listening that when you're in a seminar, I may have said this before, but when you're in a seminar and a result is presented, sometimes I just ask the presenter, how many regressions did you run? Period. How many did you run? And of those, how many found that result that you're reporting here as confirming your hypothesis? And we've talked a lot about this on the program. I'm not going to go into it now, but you're right. There's a fraudulence a little strong, but not maybe so strong given what we've learned about the replication crisis. It's most blatant in psychology, but I think it's true in every social science field. And the number of books that are written each year relying on social science studies to give cover to clever and cute contrarian hypotheses to share at a cocktail party is deeply depressing to me and a huge problem. And that's the one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is it's all cynicism anyway. It's all just cover for what people want to say, as you're kind of hinting at. These are just this is what we drape our opinions in. We use our social science, quote, research. Studies show we do that to give a scientific gloss to our opinions. And I think that's really bad for science, and it's really unhealthy for our discourse.
Not only that, it's unhealthy for democracy, right? I mean, that's fundamentally my where my contempt for this type of talk, colonizing all of politics. Now, of course, we should try to be informed by the best social science that's out there, and George Borjas is actually admirably frank about the limits of what can be known from the type of work he does. And I think he's one of the best ones. But it was still shocking to me to find out how few data points these arguments about major issues affecting the American public, how few data points we're actually relying on.
It's much.
There are larger. Of course, there are studies done on huge publicly available data sets, and maybe that work is a lot better to look at because it can be checked a little bit more easily. But I find the studies show discourse to be anti-democratic. Right? It's a kind of priestcraft that forbids the common person from saying what they want to say, right?
That's a great phrase. It's a priestcraft. And why economists are the highest priests is fascinating to me, given that our track record is mixed at best. And I don't know, maybe we use more Greek letters and more econometrics.
There's always a master science, right? It seems like it's, at least from the 20th century onward, right? There was, psychology maybe
Had a run.
Had a run,
Yeah.
and now economists are having a run.
Yeah.
And frankly, the book is pushing against it because I'm more interested in history and literature than in economics. So I'm fighting my corner in the world of letters.
Before I forget, I want to talk about your view of I would say irony. I'm going to read one more excerpt.
Oh, okay.
This is an aspect of American culture I don't see people talk about much, but I think it's really important. You say, mass media was my primary teacher growing up, and it taught me and my friends how to conform with one another. It slipped under the table to me a lesson that sincerity is a kind of weakness, that it will be used against me, and that any sentiment at all, anything that could expose you to the danger of ridicule or the genuine possession of an emotion should be double and triple saran wrapped in irony. I suppose we do this for safety somehow, as if unwrapped passion itself is so flammable it would consume our little worlds at the instant we exposed it to open air. And I felt that myself many times about our culture, that the hipster, the person who's cool, is ironic all the time. That sincerity is mocked. And I just think it's a terrible aspect of our culture. There's a great moment in your book where you talk about a drunken night where someone gets up to recite a poem and cries. And that's prime mockery material. The drunk part makes it a little more complicated, but somebody who stands up to recite something and finds it so moving that it brings them to tears, we turn away from that in America, I think, a lot. And I think that's a great loss.
Yeah, that was I was describing a night in the passage you read from. I went back to a language learning group that my mother was a part of, Dougherty, which is students of Irish in America. And there weren't that many young people there. There were a few, and we were kind of ducking away from the normal practice of sharing a party piece, right? In Ireland, this is very typical. My family does this now too. In late get-togethers, there's often each person almost is associated with a song. My father would be the Rocky Road to Dublin, or I would be the Patriot Game, and you kind of go around the room and you ask them to do their song. So we're doing this at Dougherty na Gaeilge, and the three, the younger people, myself and two others, are ducking this, and I felt like we ducked it because of this cultural formation, and there was an odd way in which, even the simplest thing is like romance, right? The romance between a young man and a young woman, that all of the popular culture around this when I was growing up was in a sense of you might be encouraged to open your heart to another person, but you would have to leaven it with some acknowledgement of how stupid or silly or flawed you were in doing this. As if you couldn't just say, "I'm in love with you," like the most natural, to me, now the most natural thing to say, and so yeah, I found that this thing that at least had existed in Irish culture, and it still does to some degree. Like I said, it happens late at night, maybe when the doors to the public are closed. There's something deeply satisfying about just saying what you love and trying to honor it in a straightforward way, that somehow American pop culture in a very insidious and probably an unconscious way, almost forbid us to do.
Oh, it's emergent. No one's decreeing it. There's no memo that says, "Don't be sincere, be ironic, make fun of anybody who's overly honestly emotional." But that is our culture.
Right. But there is something moving. And of course, the young man I was talking about who's reading this poem, he grew up in West Belfast, which, he was a child born just before the Good Friday Agreement, or not too long before the Good Friday Agreement. So, he would have older cousins, especially uncles and parents who were involved in a horrible section of Irish history and had to moralize themselves for the difficulty of that conflict imposed on them and to get through it. And like I said, it was almost alien to me. And yet, alien to me as an American to watch him recite this poem by Bobby Sands and then by the middle of it just be sobbing openly in front of people he just met. And yet it wasn't alien to me as a human, right? Like, I was deeply moved by it. And I wanted to connect with that part of myself. And I found it easier to do in this newer language, right? It wasn't just the Irish language of, Gaeilge. It was this Irish language of just unwrapped, raw emotion, which was itself liberating.
Well, if I were Irish, one of my songs would be "Four Green Fields." I would sing that. I would bellow that out, sober even. But and I will say it's an interesting thing. Parents. It's part of our job to embarrass our children. One of my children's great embarrassments is that in parking garages, which have very good acoustics, when they were younger, I would often sing "My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose," the Robert Burns poem, at the top of my lungs because I enjoyed the sound of it. And that, I think, even in ancient times was probably embarrassing to children. But I like to think that when they become parents, God willing, that they will sing in parking lots or at least sing something with emotion, because I think it's like it's like the line dance as if no one is looking.
Right.
My view is you should try to dance that way all the time. Why do you care if someone's looking? It's just not. It's better.
And this stuff is still existent. Like, it still exists. I mean, there are, even in America, right, there are sometimes military ceremonies where people allow themselves this kind of open emotion.
Yep.
There are, in Ireland itself, even today, even as I describe it as this kind of post-national, anti-nationalist phase, when the doors close at the GAA club in my father's town, and it's just the men who are left in there late at night, people will start singing these old songs, and even young people will listen kind of respectfully and solemnly, as if it's almost as if this tradition of song and balladry and national sentiment is kept like an axe or a fire extinguisher under glass, and it's sort of like a break open in case of emergency. And I've seen that across Europe. I mean, I got a chance a year or so ago to go to Budapest, and I talked to people about how their culture had kind of been in the 90s colonized by Disney, right? That, like, Disney films, everything had come over from America and filled in all the gaps that the Russians had left behind. But there was this thriving, what they called a dance hall movement. And, in the cities, they'd bring in the essentially like peasant national culture into the city for song or for dance, and it took me right back to the early scenes of this book and my early youth of seeing, cultural preservationists trying to document these different dances and local traditions before they expire, and people anxious to see them, right? And also kind of folk blurriness about where it all leads back to, right? Like I remember one particular dance was introduced and it was said, well, this one comes from, a borderland between Hungarian and Romanian speakers. So is it Hungarian? Is it Romanian? Who can really say? Here it is. and everyone loved it. So even in that spirit of trying to dwell on or recover this idea of who we are, there can even be this kind of generosity and this acknowledgement that even as we do this, what we're uncovering is that we're human, and we're also like our neighbors in some way too.
I was decrying the loss of sincerity and the unwillingness to portray emotion publicly, and yet I think there are two places where we do allow that in American culture. One is sports, right. And the second is concerts. People show they expose their rawness in those two settings. You could argue there's not much at stake there, and that's why it's not like saying I love you to someone, which has consequences. So screaming maniacally for your favorite team, something I do occasionally. I don't want to. I'm not making fun of it, but that's okay. That's all right. And in fact, it's one of the bizarre aspects of technology today is that you can watch dozens, if not hundreds, of people who have filmed their own post-game, post-goal, post-touchdown celebration, post-victory celebration. I'm a Tottenham Hotspur fan. I watched their recent extraordinary game against Ajax, and the bar exploded when, near the end of the game, Tottenham scored what was essentially the winning goal. And you could watch that celebration all around the world on Twitter and on YouTube. You can watch individuals going nuts in their own living room versus people in bars versus parties. So that's our ritual. We do have some.
And it fills in a sense where other places have vacated. I have a good story about this recently too. So my mother's best friend who introduced her to my father, this London Irish woman, Teresa Murphy, she has worked for and is a passionate fan of Fulham Football Club. And Fulham, I believe, was just relegated to the lower league, right? After it got beat by Newcastle. I'm not sure. But the football club immediately put out this video that was shared across the internet of one of their local fans and kind of a wordsmith or a mediasmith kind of giving this like speech about, we've known the highs, but we're the oldest football club in this city. And now we're in this low point, and let me wallow in the lows for a minute and then begin to talk about hope going forward.
Sure.
And it was a beautiful video. It was, he's walking along the little stadium, talking about the Great White Wall of fans that show up for Fulham football. And what I realized was that, the reason this resonates so much is that this isn't just about football, right? This is meant to speak to something deep within us, right? This deep thing that we can barely express elsewhere, which is that almost all of us feel at some point in our lives that we have been kicked around, that all of the breaks have gone against us. We're in this pit of failure, and yet we have to moralize ourselves to move forward in hope. And so it was just the depth of emotions that this little 2-minute montage was touching on. This, it really was bardic poetry. I mean, in the oldest sense of the word, trying to give the tribe a meaning after great loss. And how do you do it? With hope. It was beautiful.
But I want to extend that, because I do think you're looking at the personal level, and yet I think what makes that emotion of that speech more powerful is the fact that we want to be in things together with other people. I mention, why am I a Tottenham Hotspur fan? Well, mainly because two of my sons are, and I did hug a bunch of strangers in that bar after that goal. But I wish my sons had been there. They're scattered right now, and I didn't get to watch it with them. But the reason I cared was for them and other fans, to the extent I'm part of this nation of sports fans, and it's just one of our nations that we have. It's partly a substitute. It's partly a complement to our other forms of nationality. And I want to let you close with a comment on America, because America is discussed in passing in the book culturally, as we've talked about already. Most of the national talk in the book is about Ireland. We recently discussed America's nationalism in passing with Arthur Brooks. I was speculating that the challenge of recovering civility in our political culture is that the American tribe just doesn't motivate a significant chunk of people who live here the way it did in the past, that we have other tribes we've joined and they conflict. And so we look at others with contempt, and that's, I think, a horrible thing, and I think it's a threat to the country. As I kind of mentioned before, a lot of us think about ourselves as people who just happen to live here rather than as, say, Americans. Certainly my libertarian friends, some of my friends on the left feel that way. You just assimilate when you get here. You're not into the melting pot as an Irish American. You're nothing. You're just this thing who happens to live here without the burden of that hyphen or the identity, unless you're African American, which you can't escape it. So that's a whole different challenge. But for many of us, we craft a stateless identity without ethnic roots. And I'm curious if you think whether that can change. And if it can't, and I'm not sure it can, what do you think is going to happen here?
Well, I think the premise is a little wrong in what you said. I would challenge it. I would say that the phenomenon you're describing, where in a sense, a lot of us are in these political tribes or cultural political tribes that are in this, seemingly zero-sum contest to define what is America going forward. And I agree with you that it's a danger. But my view of nationality and nationalism, particularly political nationalism, is that it is a product of stress and strain, humiliation and failure many times, or exaltation. And that because America is this global superpower, and we can, arguably lose wars. We can lose a 20-year war in Afghanistan, hand it over to the exact same tribal people that we went in there to fight after 20 years, and there is no diminishment of American wealth or prestige that's noticeable
or hubris
on a day-to-day level, or hubris. Right? Yeah. No, exactly. No. So I think America is uniquely insulated from the pressures that cause this national and nationalist spirit to come out. But it won't always be so. Maybe our hubris will lead us into something where, like I said, we're under pressure. I do think, I do think a type of American, the so-called Trump voter, core voter in the primary, felt that their version of America was under stress and strain, and so voted for.
That's certainly true of Brexit voters as well.
Articulated that loss. So I do think that nationalist strain, I think there are a lot of reasons for it. It's not just, it's immigration, it's immigration combined with low native fertility that gives you a sense that you're not actually a part of the future of where you live in any meaningful way. But it's also this larger reaction to, a kind of internationalist political consensus that I think was anti-democratic in spirit in the last 25 years. So that I think is bringing it out a little bit. But that sense of American nationalism, when was it strongest? It was strongest during the World Wars. It was strongest in a period after the Civil War or after the War of Independence. And then it kind of fades away, and these other internal cultural battles come to the forefront. So like I said, I think people will recognize across their partisan divides, their cultural war divides, their commonality as Americans when we feel that the common inheritance that it is to be an American is in some way under threat. I just don't think America's in that position now.
I guess I had a different point I was trying to make. Oh, that was interesting. It's not quite the way I was thinking about it. You reacted to the populist version of nationalism, and I do want to alert listeners to if you missed it, the episode that we did with Yoram Hazony on his book, The Virtue of Nationalism, which touched on some of these themes. But I was actually thinking something more related to what I talked about with Jill Lepore, which is, what's our story? You talked about the Irish story a lot in this book, and it's really interesting. And for many of us don't have much of an understanding of Irish history. It was very powerful and interesting. But, what's our American story? What is that? What's the story we tell ourselves that we have in mind when we say, I'm an American? And I think we had that story. Again, there were groups that were excluded from it, obviously, in horrible, brutal ways. So that they have a different story, which I get and deeply sympathize with. But for the so-called mainstream, quote, average American, whatever that means, you need a story. And the one I just sort of hinted at one, for some people, there's a story, and then there's a footnote that we didn't live the story fully for Native Americans and blacks. So it's an imperfect story. I can't totally celebrate it, but I can celebrate it a lot for this and that. Or I could say, for example, sure, we never lived up to that all human beings in our borders were entitled to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. We enslaved people. We had a culture that made it harder for women to express themselves in many politically as well as, say, culturally and socially and professionally. We oppressed and killed Native Americans. But we had an aspiration toward greatness that we could be held to account for. And that's an American story. You might disagree with it. You might think it's dishonest. You might think it misses a lot, and you might pick a different one. But that's a story that we can tell ourselves about who we are, that we aspire to greatness. I feel like that's dying, that whole idea here. And I'm not sure we could survive the death of that story. A story. It doesn't mean that one. It has to be a story. Otherwise, there's no nation.
I do agree. I mean, and my book was written a little bit with this anxiety at heart, too. But like I said, I think I don't think we can predict what stresses and strains will come to America in the future. We can guess, right? Like I can guess that China is this rival superpower, and not just this rival military and industrial power, but as a rival model for statecraft, I think could exert pressure on us, and that what happens is that this what happens in the Irish story can happen here. There are lots of themes in Irish history that are still submerged or that didn't come out in the 1916 Rising, right? Like they picked up on the 1798 rebellion, which was mostly led by Protestant Irish nationalists, but they didn't pick up on the like deism or other aspects that were buried in that thing. They focused on the republicanism and on the question of political sovereignty. And I think just as the same way is that in America's future, whatever happens to us, whatever befalls us, suddenly the parts of the American story that are relevant to that will suddenly be jumping out as highlights in our consciousness, and that's how we'll build out in the future. I think, like I said, it might be a story of liberation, and so Lincoln might feature bravely in that. It might be a story of political fight for independence of action and sovereignty, and so the founding generation will stand out. I don't know. It might be a struggle with tyranny in Europe or something, and suddenly FDR and that story of an increasingly diverse America shaped by immigration coming together as one will be highlighted. Something like that will happen to America in the future. Some struggle, some stimulus that will bring out our sense of our nationality and will bring out what's valuable in it in that time. Whether it's a sense of liberation, a sense of better justice or equality, we will find those, or whether it's some great compromise, some great democratic compromise, we'll find stories in our history that resonate with that. And so you retell the story again. And that's only human.
My guest today has been Michael Brendan Dougherty. His book is My Father Left Me Ireland. Michael, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you so much.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.